Okay, so let's make a start. Good morning, everyone. My name is Andrea Davis. I am the International Programme Manager at the Civil Service College. And just like to say a big welcome to those who have not joined our webinar series before. I am joined by Jim Brooks, who has kindly stepped in to do the session this morning for us, very last minute. And of course, as you know, the session this morning is based on financial and commercial awareness for leaders. The session should start approximately 1 minute or 2 minutes or so, but just quickly, just let you know that it is being recorded. So for anyone that hasn't been able to join this morning, any contacts or colleagues, please do forward this video on once it's been recorded and put on our YouTube channel. Just to let you know, if there is, again, I know I've reiterated it a few times, if there's any connection issues, if you can't hear me, if you can't hear Jim for whatever reason, please just put it in the Q&A or comments box at the bottom of the screen just to let us know. And the session will probably last around 1 hour. So if we could just go to the next slide, please. Okay, so Civil Service College, for those that do not know who we are and what we do, we are an independent training organisation that offers training solutions to the UK civil service and the wider public sector. We have delivered training to not just central government departments, such as the Cabinet Office, DEFRA and DWP, but also devolved administrations like the Welsh Government and, of course, our NHS, as well as local authorities. Next slide, please. Not only do we work in the UK, we also work internationally. So you can see our international footprint here as well. So if there's any training needs abroad, or if you are an international delegate that would like to do their training here in the UK, we do offer that as well. Trainers like Jim can actually go and do the training overseas, or if you would prefer to talk to me, about any further training in the UK when travel permits, we can offer that solution as well. Thank you. Our course categories, we offer around about 70 different types of courses, ranging from accountability and governance to leadership and management, professional development, policy, law and legal, media, digital and data, and finance and commercial. Of course, this webinar today will fall under the finance and commercial series. We do offer one-day, full-day courses based on the topics that we will be discussing today. So if you would like to find out more about the full day or the longer courses that we do based on today's webinar, please do get in touch with myself or Jim, and we will give you more information on that. Thank you. Our services. Okay, so we obviously offer open courses, but because obviously the current situation now that we are all facing, we are now taking everything online as well. So we do offer all of our courses virtually. So please do check out our website. If there's anything on there as well, we can discuss with you about virtual packages and so on. We also offer tailored solutions, so we can actually put together a programme or a course based on the training needs of your organisation or for yourself. So if you want to speak to myself or my colleagues at any point, do get in touch and we can put something together for you and design a programme that meets your needs. And of course, again, we work internationally, like I mentioned before. So if you want any of our trainers to visit your country and deliver any of our courses, please do get in touch. Or again, we can speak to you about you coming over to the UK and having your training based in London. All right, so as mentioned, today's session will be on financial and commercial awareness for leaders. In this webinar, we will explore why financial and commercial awareness is essential to leaders by looking at the role and importance of finance within organisations, the importance of planning and managing the forecast in line with the vision, mission and goals of an organisation, risk and contingencies within a commercial process, external forces and their impact on your organisation, and the responsibility for creating a future. So again, we are joined by the wonderful Jim Brooks, who is our expert trainer. So Jim, would you like to make a start?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I've just noticed I'm wearing the same shirt that I was in Washington outside the White House that day last year, training. As you can see, I've been in local government and working with central government for a long time, and have worked in the private sector for the last 15 years or so. I learned a lot becoming a chief executive, and it taught me that finance on its own can't direct an organisation, but coupled with direction, with vision, with mission, with values, finance can be a hugely valuable tool in making progress towards your strategic objectives. Finance makes a massive contribution to corporate governance. I've actually come to the conclusion that you can't have strong corporate governance without good financial management. The research suggests that good organisations have good corporate governance, and organisations that don't have good corporate governance don't perform as well. So could I have the next slide, please? I've defined it at the top. I'm not going to go through slides in detail. I think they can constitute a workbook that you can go through afterwards, but I will refer to them as we go through. If we're working on the same basis, corporate governance is the set of processes, customs, policies, laws and institutions affecting the way an organisation's actually run. It includes your strategic framework, your vision, mission, values. It talks about how an organisation operates rather than what it actually does. It's about the way you make decisions, the way in which you set out the rules of engagement, accountability within the organisation, and how you deal with those two desperately difficult issues of risk and performance. Could I have the next slide, please? These days, managers have got to be able to manage finance. The first time I ever met a permanent secretary in government, he said something like, well, of course, I have someone who looks after the money, as if somehow that meant he didn't have to. These days, a good manager, senior manager, manages resources. You manage the assets, the people, the money, and the information, the data entrusted to you, particularly in the public sector. And it's your job to deploy those resources in pursuit of the strategic objectives of the organisation. Not of your little department, not in warfare with other areas of the organisation, but as a corporate endeavour. I've set out a strategic framework. It's one of the things you do as a consultant. You go into an organisation and you help them to look at their vision, their mission, their values. Why are we here? What are we doing? And you can see, here's one that I worked on. We use letters that produce the word impact. You can choose any word. I suggest you don't choose one that's pejorative in any way, but inspiring, making, partnerships, being authoritative, curious and truthful, those sorts of values are the ones which a leader will look for in their organisation. Why are we here? What difference can we make to our customers? Do we know our customers and our clients well enough? Are we making a difference? What could we do that would improve our performance? What could we do that would impact positively on people's lives? And if we adopt a strategic framework, a vision, mission and values, what objectives would we choose that would move us nearer to those strategic long-term objectives? And how do we engage in the public sector with our political framework with our decision-making process, with our councillors, with our MPs. And in the private sector, how do we engage with the board? How do we make sure that there is a linkage, a direct link between our strategic framework, our values, our mission, our vision, and what we actually are deciding to do in future that would bring it closer? When I first became a chief executive in Poole in Dorset, I went around the organisation asking people what was important to them. And one of the things that cropped up again and again was the need for a harbour crossing. Our Poole is a channel port, and the road links to the port were poor. We focused on a lifting bridge, and if that bridge raised for any purpose when a cross-channel ferry was disgorging vehicles, cars and lorries, the whole of the time used to jam up. So this objective of a new harbour crossing cropped up again and again, and I realised that nobody was actually doing anything to bring that bridge closer. And so one of the things that I changed was a direct objective of trying to secure the bridge. It was over 10 years later when the bridge was actually built, but at least we managed to do it eventually. There are 3 jobs on a boat: rowing, bailing, and steering are the key ones. And if you're really good at bailing or rowing, you might get promoted to be the head bailer or the head rower, and even then become a manager to steer the boat. And once you're up on the deck and steering, focusing on direction, about going somewhere, if something goes wrong below decks, it's very tempting to use all your skill and experience to race downstairs and to rescue, I should say, below decks, and to bail or to row and to put things right. But the moment you leave the bridge, then you're not steering. And if you're not steering, then either somebody else is or nobody is. And you have betrayed your trust and you're not doing the job for which you're paid. And your job is the strategic framework and the objectives and making it become real. You can only do that with resources. So could I have the next slide, please?
And I just want to remind participants, at any point, if you do have any questions for Jim, or if you want to make any comments on the topic that Jim's touching on, please use the Q&A box at the bottom.
Okay, good, thank you. Thanks, Andrea. The key mechanism for allocating resources in most organisations is the budget. In theory, it is the financial expression of your operation and service plans. But anyone who's worked in an organisation knows that that's not true. The budget is an amalgamation, is the culmination of many years of struggle, of departments putting up bids, of some being accepted, some being refused, of almost a departmental struggle, not a corporate one, to protect resources and to improve them wherever you can. The job of the chief executive, the job of the leader, is to align the strategic objectives with the money, with the resources necessary to achieve those strategic objectives. And so your financial targets, the sophistication of your managers depends for its success on alignment of the resources to the strategic objectives. And that means managers who manage resources proactively in pursuit of those objectives, not protecting resources, not defending against all comers, but prepared to utilise the resources entrusted to them to achieve those objectives. And that gives you a basis for performance monitoring. The budget has complicated origins. The first is that fundamentally it's a bottom-up process. People everywhere in the organisation work out how much it costs to run their service, add it all together to get service, budgets, departments, and bigger chunks of budget to take to the corporate table. At the same time, the Director of Finance and the leadership of the organisation is saying, what can we afford next year? What can we tax? What can we do in terms of our pricing policies? How can we balance our strategic objectives with the requirements to run existing services? And so bottom up and top down meet in the middle with some pulling and hauling to make it all fit, and then we all heave a sigh of relief and get on with things for another year. Difficult against that background to measure your progress towards objectives. There's another dilemma about budgets, and that is that whilst it's a controlling mechanism, it says, here you are, here's £50 million to run a service, or here's a profit target to achieve £1 million over the next year, or £2 million. A controlling mechanism. Do not spend more than that budget. Do not fail to achieve your objectives. At the same time, it's an enabling mechanism. It says, here you are, I am entrusting you with substantial sums of money, particularly in the public sector. Go away, manage those resources, make things better. It is empowering and yet controlling. Ironically, too, it's the critical documents in the public sector. How much is the budget and how well did you do against it? It seems to be the only major financial decision or judgment that's made, particularly in retrospect. In the private sector, it's an internal confidential document. It's not published. It's an internal control mechanism. So budgets are a key element in accountancy, in setting directions, in pushing messages down the organisation, in receiving messages up from the operational coalface where things actually happen. I just want a word on the other core documents in the financial armoury. There's the balance sheet. Most organisations spend very little time with their balance sheets. In the private sector, the balance sheet is the key document. If someone wants to buy shares in your organisation, they will look at the balance sheet. That tells you how strong the organisation is. If you look at 4 or 5 balance sheets, in turn you will see trends. Is the organisation becoming stronger or weaker? Does it have the resources to meet its future obligations? Does it have the reserves to meet changes in fashion, in need, in obsolescence, in a whole range of things? Does it have the cover to pay dividends over time? And the standard tests that accountants use and financial analysts work extremely well. But in the public sector, we don't use them. By the time we've finished closing down our budgets, we're tired. We need to work on the current year to see how well that's going. And it's not very long before we're working on next year's budget. So we don't sit and reflect enough. We don't think about where we're going and where we've been, and perhaps we need to do so more. When I became a consultant and advising public service organisations, I used to do an analysis of the balance sheet before I went in. 9 times out of 10, by the time I was talking to the chief executive and director of finance, I knew more about the organisation than 95% of the people who worked in it in terms of its financial strength. Don't forget too that there are many other resource allocation mechanisms going on at the same time. There's a capital programme, there are vehicle replacement programmes, IT development strategies, there are plans associated with staffing and with assets and with information. So Those are the tools that help finance, that help leadership to determine future direction and to produce that alignment between the financial resources and the direction of the organisation. So could I have the next slide, please?
Just a couple of questions there, Jim. Someone's just put in the Q&A box. Can we prioritise budget allocation? Got a lady that's just put that in there.
I think we can, and we should, and it should be a top-down thing. I did a very simple thing when I went to Poole. I was very frustrated, having been City Treasurer of Manchester. You would think that that gave you enormous power over resources. Well, it doesn't necessarily. In a big and complex organisation, there are powerful forces pulling in all sorts of directions. When I went to Poole, one of the things I did was to say to the management team, I'm going to take 1% off every budget, but I'm not confiscating it. I'm going to put it in the middle of the table, and we will bid for it in terms of our strategic objectives. And we won't take any money away. We will redistribute the whole of that 1%, but it will be in support of our strategic objectives and not just what we did last year. There is a problem, I think, that big budgets tend to stay big and small budgets stay small, and it's difficult to reallocate resources. So from that point of view, this is an extremely good question, because if you don't prioritise, you don't make the progress of reallocating resources in terms of your strategic objectives.
Great.
Does that help?
Yes, fantastic. Next slide. Thank you.
Okay. So financial reporting is the way we actually judge what we do. Once we've got our budget, we've set our direction, we report on an annual basis to say, how well do we do? If it's private sector, can we attract investment? How do we make decisions based on our reporting against our objectives? When I first went into local government, financial reporting was weak. Essentially, what the Director of Finance did after the end of the year was say, well, we didn't do terribly well. Our financial reporting mechanisms weren't strong enough mid-year to say, we need to change things. We need to change things to prevent an overspend or to reallocate resources to be more effective. But these days, we have that advantage and we should do it. So we should be thinking about our business cases, the bids for external resources, loan applications, dividend levels, a whole range of elements that run an organisation. The final accounts, the annual report, tells the story of our financial performance. And it's the job of the Director of Finance with the Chief Executive to say, how well did we act as stewards? How well did we spend the money? How well did we achieve our objectives? And where are we now in terms of the balance sheet, our statement of net worth? What do we do next? And also to check our alignment. How successful were we? We will be complying with the law. We will be being accountable to our stakeholders and demonstrating our corporate governance. Remarkably, financial reporting, well, ask yourself, when did I last read the financial report? And did I compare it with the previous years? Do we actually think about the journey we're on, where we've been and where we're going? One last thing on financial reporting. Governments have moved towards resource accounting and budgeting, away from cash budgeting and cash accounting. Still, most countries in the world do that. And when you move towards accruals and distinguishing between capital and revenue in resource accounting and budgeting, for the very first time, you are recording actual expenditure on the same basis as you are budgeting. And that means the comparisons are more accurate. I'll return to that if there's an appetite for it, but I just wanted to cover it. Could I have the next slide, please? Financial reporting isn't just about the history. It's not just about what happens after year end. How are we doing during the year? Can we take accurate reports to our board, to our politicians, to our decision-making level that says, how well are we doing? Can we change things? Do we need to slow down? Do we need to speed up? How sure are we that the leadership that we impose in the allocation of resources is reflected within the organisation? And when the reports come up, the trouble is, if you ask most people about financial reports, they will say, well, they're long, they're boring, and I don't read them. Because I'm just, every month we have an agenda that's 3 inches thick, and we spend 20 minutes on it, and the Director of Finance says, we're not doing terribly well. And it doesn't change things. Well, it should do. This is our opportunity to compare how we're doing against the direction set. What are the trends? What are those comparisons? What are the numbers telling us about the volumes of people using our services? As an independent board member on a government department, we used to get figures about people who were visiting country parks. And the numbers used to move up and down fairly dramatically. And yet the money always stayed the same. There was no link between the people using the services and the costs. And gradually, we started to produce a monthly document that looked at the volumes, the volumetrics across the whole of the department. How many people are using our services? What are they using them for? To build up a picture of comparisons with the money. So what would happen if we spent more money on country parks? Would more people come? What would happen if we spent less? Would there be a dramatic fall in the number of people using the service? How do you support the board or the minister? They have entrusted you with resources. They've said, yes, I agree, we're going to go in this direction. So how do you repay that support? What happens if you suddenly attend a meeting where your board member or your politician is under attack for overspending or for failing to achieve certain objectives? Imagine how the Secretary of Health must be feeling at the moment in terms of the pandemic. How well are we doing in terms of dealing with this problem? So, for example, I've been working with a government in Africa that is introducing international accounting standards and distinguishing between capital and revenue, moving away from cash budgeting. And it's costing huge sums of money in terms of new computer systems, new accounting systems. And the Minister of Finance is under constant pressure because people around the cabinet are saying to the President, we're spending all this money on accountancy, but we've got children who can't go to school. We've got people who we've not even got secure food supplies or water supplies. We're not immunising our population against diseases that are preventable. We've got insurgents on our borders, and yet we're spending money on accounting. And we've had to brief the Minister very carefully to say, we're joining the international community. We're attracting international money. We can bid for resources from the United Nations and from a whole range of donors to attract money into the country that will change things in the longer term. And we have to do that, because if we don't, eventually our bids will fail. But as the Minister turned around and said, yeah, but we've got an election next year. And when I go and speak to people, when I address a rally, there are not people in the audience waving banners saying, we want international public service accounting standards and we want them now. So you have an obligation to support your ministers, your board members, for the support that they give you in terms of your direction. Do we identify trends, risks and opportunities? Do we share information across the organisation? Are we reinforcing leadership and good behaviour? Are we learning the lessons of overspends and underspends to support future resource allocation? And are we contributing to performance and managing risk? The last thing to say on this subject, internal financial reporting, is that after 30 years in local government, a qualified accountant, I went into the private sector, and the biggest shock that I got in culture was internal financial reporting. Every month, we had to go to see our board member in Capita to explain our progress towards our profit. And our finance officer sat with the board member, not with us. And if we were achieving our financial targets, it was a really friendly and short meeting. We used to talk about Arsenal Football Club and Porsche motor cars. But if we were falling behind, the conversation took on a much tougher tone. Well, what are you doing about it? How many people are you employing? What bids have you made? Do you want to take over other businesses? What are you doing about achieving your profit target? And that discussion became tougher and tougher and tougher every month. And it was very clear that if you weren't going to achieve your target, then eventually they would look for a management team that would. And that was the strongest difference between the public sector and the private sector. Our internal financial reporting in the public sector does not change things quickly enough, fundamentally enough, and is not strong enough. So we need to improve it, to make it more real, to use dashboards, to make it more accessible, to train our managers to use resources and to manage budgets better. And we are failing in our duty in terms of leadership if we don't do that. I'd be really interested to hear if other people have got similar experiences to that. So, could I have the next slide, please? I want to talk a bit about risk. This is the classic photograph that I always use for risk. Could I have the next slide, please? This is risk management. I've set out here the risk process. I'm not going to go through it. You can find this in most textbooks. Risk management is about identifying what can go wrong, what can come out of the blue sky and knock us off our route, our chosen direction, can prevent us achieving our objectives. We need to identify them, codify them, and manage them. We need to look at the likelihood of an event occurring and the impact if it does, to take remedial action, and to bring down the risk within the organisation's risk appetite. So somebody in the organisation needs to fall asleep worrying about the risks. I think the most important thing that I need to say about risk is that it's become a negative thing. People think about weaknesses and threats. What can go wrong? What do we need to change to stop those problems preventing us from achieving our objectives? What I say to you today is, think about the other part of the analysis. Think about SWOT analysis. We all know that. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. Risk management is not just about weaknesses and threats. It's about our strengths, about capitalizing on them, about making sure that we remain sustainable, that our finances remain strong, that our training means that our people are developing and the organisation is moving forward, that we're managing our assets well. We play to our strengths. And what are our opportunities? How can we make sure we don't miss them, that we capitalise them and move forward? So think SWOT and don't just think negative. The second thing I'd say is think about risk appetite, because it varies with the organisation. Imagine the difference between a hospital and an army platoon. In a hospital, you're there to try and keep people alive, to make sure no one comes to any harm. In the army, there are manageable risks, and it may make sense to say to a small number of people, we want you to go and do something extremely dangerous that is hazardous to your life, but for the good, for the greater good. And we don't want to risk all our resources on that endeavour. And so the appetite for risk varies according to the organisation. Think about, for example, your own management of cash in the public sector. If you're investing money, for example, as a local authority, the last thing you want to do is lose the money. So you put it somewhere safe. You don't push for that last 0.25% to get a better return. But if you're a city investment broker, you do. And so your appetite for risk is very different depending on the type of organisation you're in and the circumstances you meet. Managing risk is a critical part of making sure that nothing goes wrong against your objectives. But I'm a firm believer that you can't manage an organisation well through the risk management prism. It's not imaginative enough. It's not visionary. Risk management is worrying about what can go wrong from where you are. On the other hand, you need to think quite broadly about it. My first experience of risk management was in Manchester, where I was responsible in one of the local authorities for business continuity, and that included the computer installation. And so we developed reciprocal arrangements with our neighbours who had a very similar computer, that if our computer went down for any reason, we could use theirs in the old days of mainframes. And if something happened to theirs, they could come and use ours. And then a couple of years later, there was severe flooding, and our cellar, where we kept the computer, why do you keep a computer in the cellar? Well, partly because it used to be very heavy. Our computer room was flooded out. Mid-morning, I rang our neighbours to say, I need to invoke our reciprocal arrangements. And he said, oh my God, I was just going to ring you, because we need to invoke the reciprocal arrangements because our computer room's been flooded. And the one thing we hadn't thought of was that both buildings, although in separate local authorities and 15 miles apart, were on the same river. So risk management is something where you can't foresee every contingency, but you need to use your imagination and think broadly about it. In another local authority, in a traditional town hall with many floors, I observed a member of staff once cleaning the outside of the window without hooking on to the hooks that we had expensively installed throughout the building to enable people to lean out of the window safely. And so I said to him, you need to hook on, that's important. And he said, well, we'd never get the job done in time. So if it's fairly low and it's quick, we ignore it. I raised that because I was troubled by it. Essentially, over the next year, we externalised the service. Because part of risk management, one of the responses to it is to externalise it, to transfer the risk to someone else. And so we employed a private sector company who cleaned our windows, and they were experts, and they all hooked on because their health and safety was stronger and their management and supervision was stronger than ours. And I regretted it because we'd externalised the service. But on the other hand, the job of a local authority is to provide services to people in need in the community, not to clean our windows. And I realised that we were spending more and more time on maintaining, running the office, running the service, rather than achieving our objectives. And that's not surprising, because if you think about it, a local authority will be the biggest landlord, the biggest supplier of accommodation, the biggest caterer, the biggest vehicle operator, the biggest accountancy practice, legal practice. We are a big business. The public sector is big and influential and a big buyer in the private market, and managing risk is very important. I think there's one other thing I'd say about risk and contingencies. Contingencies are important because we need to be able to smooth out the peaks and troughs of activity. We need not money for a rainy day, but we need reserves in case something goes wrong. If something goes catastrophically wrong, like a pandemic, no government would have enough resources to meet a challenge like that. But smaller challenges that you're much more likely to face on a day-to-day basis, shouldn't prevent you from achieving your objectives. And too often, I've heard people say, well, we were doing pretty well until something happened, until we needed a new roof, until we had a surge of people reporting with needs, or until something changed, some new regulations, new legislation, changes in the way we have to deliver services. And when that happens, it's important to have some reserves that you can draw on. When we became a unitary authority in Poole, not long after, in Poole itself, we had a really harrowing case of child abuse. And our children's services were so small that within the first day or two, the whole organisation of our children's services was overwhelmed by the severity and the challenge that this individual case presented. And so I went to Bournemouth, our next door neighbours, explained the situation. We had a really good relationship, and they gave us resources, additional resources, to help us through the crisis. And importantly, I was able to transfer some of my resource to them to give people a change, away from the terrible pressures and the harrowing experiences that our social workers were facing. And if you don't have that capacity, either through agreements with your neighbours or through the maintenance of some reserves and some additional resources, then you face severe difficulties when things go wrong. There's one more thing I'd say about contingencies, and that's value. When I was in the private sector, I was asked to review a property deal that was going through in a new unitary authority. They had an urgent need for new building accommodation for about, I forget the numbers, maybe 500, 600 people. And their property guy, who I had a lot of time for, good guy, went out and he negotiated to take over an entire office block in the city. And it was a spec development, so it was empty. So we had immediate occupation opportunity. And he had achieved a rental, an annual rental for a substantial period, I think 10 years with an option to go to 20, which was a fair bit, maybe 10% below the market value in the city at the time. And so it seemed like a good deal. What could possibly go wrong? And why shouldn't we deal and get on with it? But I knew the chief executive and he knew me, and he said, well, let me just give it to these guys to have a look at. I was in the private sector. And I had a look at it, and between us, we asked the developer for a substantial sum of money, several £1 million in cash as a premium. and the developer stormed out and disappeared for a couple of days, but eventually, to cut a long story short, signed, and we got the premium. And it was one of the best pieces of business I did in the private sector. The saving to the local authority in terms of the fee that I was able to charge was not great for me. I asked for a percentage and they just said no, which I don't blame them. But the point is that what the local authority did was to say, we will sign to occupy this building for a minimum of 10 years and perhaps 20. Now, the developer has built the building on spec. Huge sums of money have gone out in planning, in permissions, in construction, in advertising, and the developer is stretched at that point. He or she wants to move the building on, wants to get value for the building, ideally wants to sell it so that the developer then can go and build more buildings. In order to do that, he would securitize it. He would sell the building to a pension fund, to somebody interested in a long-term investment. Now, if it's empty, it's likely to get filled in a piecemeal way, and that'll be expensive to manage, and tenants will come and go. But if you can get a promise from a government organisation that you will occupy it for 10 years with an option for 20, what you are then selling to the pension fund or to the financial institution is not the building, but an income stream. And your promise on that piece of paper is worth millions to the developer, because he or she can securitize the building at a much higher fee, get much more money up front and go off and do something else. And that's what the council had missed in those negotiations, even though it was a very good deal. So the point in terms of risk and contingency is that you can't make informed decisions unless you know the source of the profit of the person on the other side of the table. To negotiate, you have to know their business model. And if you don't, it's not safe to be in those waters, because you will lose money substantially. So, next slide, please.
We have had a couple of questions through, but what I'm going to do is keep those just towards the end. So for the participants that's asked those questions, we'll get back to those very shortly, okay?
Okay, good, thank you.
Brilliant.
I won't spend much time on this. Just to remind you that risk is not a negative exercise. To think SWOT, it is about strengths and opportunities as well, and to remind you that reserves and contingencies help you plan and to smooth out the bumps in the road. Just think about risk in terms of private sector. Would any of you open a pub at this moment? Do you think that that would be a good entrepreneurial move? Would you move into travel agency? Do you think that those are areas where there's money to be made? Whatever happened to things like blockbuster video shops? Does anyone here still have a Sony Walkman? You know, things move very quickly. And if you're on the wrong end of those technological moves, you're in the wrong place. So, could I have the next slide, please? I want to talk about uncertainties and external forces. Those changes in supply and demand we were just talking about demonstrate how good organisations can be beached by dramatic and rapid changes in demand, both in the public and the private sector. Just think about the impact of the Brexit vote on the David Cameron government. It was dramatic. Within days, David Cameron was saying, I'm not the person to lead this. You know, I didn't want to lead the European Union. Our recommendation was you didn't, and now I feel as if my time has come to leave. In one local authority I worked, there was a substantial chemical business in the borough. It was the biggest Austrian company. They're called Merck Chemicals, and they were opening a big extension to their factory and employing maybe another 250 people. And the mayor was asked to perform the opening ceremony, and we went. And so I talked to the managing director, you know, what's happening? And he said, we make liquid crystal displays. This is in the mid-90s. If you have a calculator, if you have a computer, a home computer, if you have a digital alarm clock, you will use liquid crystal displays in your pocket calculator. And 90% of the world's liquid crystal displays are supplied by us. We have a technological lead. We are doing great things. Our research and development is moving forward. We are in a world-beating situation. And 3 years later, they closed the factory. And so, not surprisingly, I went and asked him about it and said, well, what happened? And he said, well, the Chinese is what happened. A year after we'd established our strong position, they came in and they were charging about 40% of what we were charging for technology that was indistinguishable from ours. They just caught up. And he said, of course, you know, if you're on Windows 7, you can move to Windows 10 to whatever the latest version is. If you're on an iPhone 4, you can move to an iPhone 8 or whatever it is very quickly. You don't have to go through all the intermediary stages. And he said within 6 months, we'd had to sharpen our pencils, halve our prices, and really try to hang on rather than sit and enjoy the cash cow element of our business model. And he said, no sooner as we did that, then the Chinese halved the prices again. And he said within 2 years, we'd lost all but a few defence contracts. And so we had no choice but to close the company. We are completely outclassed in terms of pricing for our technology. You can be knocked out of the water by other things, by new legislation, by a pandemic, by obsolescence, by the competition, by not managing your risk. In the mid-90s, Nigeria, the government, priced its government policies on an oil price of $90 a barrel. And the oil price went up to 120. And with that huge bonus in money, they looked at their finance minister, who was an extremely able woman who'd come out of the World Bank, and she recommended paying off the national debt. And that's what Nigeria did. They paid off the whole of the national debt. And sensibly started borrowing immediately. But it was a remarkable achievement. And then the oil price started to fall. And when it fell to 40, the Nigerians stopped foreign travel. I was working for a number of trainers at the time, and the Nigerian contingents on most courses was the difference between profit and loss. And they just stopped coming. And companies like Reaper International, PAI, and a number of others immediately ran into financial difficulties as a knock-on from the fact that Nigeria's being a petro currency and with substantial amounts of oil had lost its position because the international oil price had collapsed. And why did that happen? Well, the conspiracy theories say that Saudi Arabia dropped the oil price to undermine the American shale developing market that was going to extract oil and fuel from shale. And by dropping the price of the oil, made it less economic. for the exploitation of those resources. So things can happen across the world that change the way in which you operate, that have a huge impact on what you do. I'm sure people listening will have had similar experiences. One of the most difficult for me has been in the field of partnership, PPP and PPI, where we've entered into long-term partnerships with private sector organisations to procure new buildings and new services. And huge amounts of investment have taken place in the UK over the last 20 years, particularly in the public sector. Over 40 hospitals, billions of pounds worth of investment. And the problem has been, in terms of the PFI reviews that I've done, is in terms of what happens at the end of the deal. What happens at the end of your 30 years when you've been renting a hospital? If you've not planned to build a new one in that time, and you would start to have to build it in year 20 or 22 of a 30-year deal, then you will have no choice but to enter a secondary leasing period to continue to rent that building. And that's bad business, because anyone who's involved in leasing will know that you've paid for it in the first primary period. And if you carry on renting it, then you're buying it again. So very difficult, to be sure. And are you sure that you've transferred the risk properly? The private sector doesn't like uncertainty and will price it in, and it makes it expensive. So you have to think very hard about these long-term agreements. What happens at the end? Where does their profit come from? What will you do about changes in the level of services? How will you make sure that people at operational level know what the specification is and what level of service they can expect to have over that period? Uncertainty is expensive, and external forces can influence your organisation dramatically. And if you're not prepared for it, in terms of your risk and performance, in terms of business continuity, in terms of disaster recovery, you may find yourself in serious difficulty. Could I have the next slide, please? So your job as a leader is to drive performance from the top. With a cost-conscious culture, every decision should be based on an informed financial assessment, on a business plan, on a set of objectives, on some measurable performance indicators. You need professionalism so that your managers understand money, understand what's being told to them by their financial advisor. What do I need to do next? Can I manage them? Do I need to slow things down? Can I speed things up? Can I move resources around? How do I do that well? And in order to support that level of improved professionalism and a cost-conscious culture driving performance, you need expert central functions. You need to pay bills quickly, and accurately. You need to pay people. You need to get the accounts out quickly in a format that suits the management style of the organisation and the managers delivering them. Leadership is about providing the facilities to enable people to manage, get out of the way and let people do their jobs. One of the things I did as a chief executive was to think, what's next? And it was a habit of mine that people actually mimicked. They used to say, oh, what's next? And it appeared in a program, a television program later, and people referred to me and said, that's exactly what Jim Brooks used to say. Not every Saturday, but some Saturdays, I used to go into the office and have an empty desk and do some thinking that wasn't based on people providing reports to me. Let me give you a tip. When someone gives you a report that's got a heading on it and a title page, don't open it. Before you start reading, write down on the cover of the report what you would expect to see in that report. If it's a children's play strategy, or a care of the elderly, or a mental health strategy, or an education strategy, or trading standards, whatever it is, just try and imagine what you would expect to see in a report of that. Write down your half dozen business points, your bullet points, and then read the report. Be guided by your own thoughts rather than led by the analysis of someone else. And so when you meet people and talk about the report, you can say, did you think about this? Did you think about that? Because you've done some of your independent thinking before you get there. But generally speaking, you need to have a bit of distance. Remember me saying there are 3 jobs on a boat? When you're steering, you need to think not just about what your nearest objective is, avoiding the rock that's immediately in front of you, but where are you going? Do you need to turn back and rescue, get the fleet together again to make sure that you move evenly towards your objectives? Could I have the next slide, please? This is the last slide. Creating a future is your greatest responsibility. So sitting at an empty desk and thinking, what do I need to do next? Where does my organisation need to position itself to be of greatest use? Or if you're in negotiations with people, what's the person on the other side of the table thinking? What's their business model? Where's the point at which they're going to say, so far and no further? How do I position my own negotiation to make sure that we do well? I remember a set of negotiations in one authority where I worked, where it was a planning obligations, and it had become an area that I was very interested in, and I didn't think that we were challenging the developers enough to get enough planning gain from the granting of planning obligations, where the value of the land increases tenfold or more when planning permission is given. And we had set up a small multidisciplinary task force to try and negotiate better. And the task force first job, they'd said, we need to go into the developer and we're going to ask for a certain number of affordable housing units. And it seemed like a big push. The organisation, the planners, very nervous of asking for it. Even the multidisciplinary team knew that we were pushing the envelope. And eventually, our negotiating team went into those negotiations and made the demand. And the negotiating team on the other side of the table looked at each other, looked up and said, okay. And we knew then we got it wrong. We hadn't asked for enough. It was too easy. So unless you know the business model of the people you're negotiating with, unless you understand future direction, you're not going to get these negotiations right. So how do you position your organisation strategically and practically to make a difference? Is your strategic framework still relevant? Do you need to refresh it? Do you need to change it? Have you created the culture and set of standards, and can you pass it on? In 12 years as a chief executive, I attended every induction course. Everybody joining the organisation got to see me, and I would go through the vision, the mission, the values, and the key strategic objectives and speak without notes. And it struck me, someone once complimented me on it, and I remember thinking, how can you manage an organisation and not know that stuff? How can it not be engraved in your heart? Your job is to empower the organisation. Turn the pyramid upside down. You're not at the top, you're at the bottom. Your job is to empower people to achieve their objectives. They're the people who make the difference, not you. And there are many futures. So aim for one that's got you in it and your organisation. And your leadership depends on an understanding of the efficient and effective allocation of resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. That was great. Thank you. Now, I know that there's a couple of questions that a few of our panelists, participants have asked. So I'm just going to quickly throw the questions at you just before we wrap up. So someone mentioned earlier, how can we have a fixed balance sheet in public sector as there are benefits and profits that can't be calculated?
Extremely difficult. And the trouble is that profit is a deceptively simple measure. And Capita, I'm not going to criticise Capita, hugely successful organisation, but they didn't tolerate losses for very long. They didn't invest for a long-term future. And I think that's a weakness. So when you come into the public sector and you're saying, well, what difference does my organisation make? You can't measure it by profit, but you can compare with other organisations. How much does it cost to deal with a similar case in a different organisation with a different style of support? If you think about criminal justice, how does a custodial sentence measure up against a probation order? You don't have to secure someone, lock them up for so many months, which costs a fortune. And what's the purpose of that? Are we punishing them or are we rehabilitating? So unless we've got clear objectives of what it is we're trying to do, and some performance measures of how do we know whether we've achieved it or not, I think we're wasting our time. And in the public sector, there are lots of examples of where we have relied on performance measures that may not be very good. The Tony Blair government said, if you can't measure it, it's not important. And I just don't agree with that. How do you measure loyalty? How do you measure the love you have for your family? Is it 7 out of 10? It's just nonsense. So I think the public sector, I think it's a really good question and probably the hardest question to answer in the public service.
Yeah. So just quickly on the back of that one, in a nutshell, Deborah had asked, how do you measure a risk, for example, monetary value?
So some risks are quite easy because you know that if you invest £1 million and you lose it, you've lost £1 million. That's really straightforward. But quite often there's collateral damage when something goes wrong, and ones that aren't immediately seen. Good example is the pandemic now. What is the effect on cancer sufferers, on routine operations? I'm recovering. A year ago I had a new hip, and it's made a huge difference to me. Me and my dog have walked 2,500 miles this year around the village. And yet my younger brother and my older sister are both waiting for hip replacements and can't have them because of the pandemic. And it's very difficult to say what the impact on the quality of their life is, and the impact, you can't measure that in terms of cost. So difficult. I think you can make some measures in terms of lost assets. What you can't measure easily is lost opportunity. Could our children have had a better education? My daughter started a degree course this year, and some of her lessons are online. She's with some second-year students who are all online, and the quality of their education is unlikely to be as good as it would be if they were attending normal teaching. So I think there is a risk and a penalty of those sorts of things when external forces force you to change your style of direction.
Yeah.
Very tough.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that, Jim. I can see that a lot of our participants have left some fantastic feedback, which I will give forward on to Jim. So thank you very, very much for your time. So if we could just go to the next slide, please. For those that are still logged on with us, if you want to find out more about our webinars that we run each week, please do sign up to our training alerts at www.civilservicecollege.org.uk. Just to check out what we are planning and delivering each week. And yeah, next slide, please. And please do stay connected with us. This is our social media handle. We are on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And just to reiterate that this recording will be put on YouTube throughout the week. So please do check our YouTube channel out. Next slide, please.
Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed that.
Yeah, that's it. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jim. That was brilliant. And to our participants, we do hope that you benefited from this morning. And again, please do stay in touch with us if you do have any questions. And I'm sure Jim will happily, assist with those.
With pleasure. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much, Jim. And we hope to see you very soon. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Have a good day, everyone. Bye bye.